Joel Dimsdale is a longtime faculty member at UCSD in the Department of Psychiatry. He originally attended Carleton College, where he received an MA in sociology, and Stanford University, where he earned his MD. Following his residency training in psychiatry at the Massachusetts General Hospital, he served on the psychiatry faculty of Harvard Medical School from 1976 to 1985. He then moved to UCSD, where he is now Regent Edward Dixon Professor Emeritus and Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry Emeritus. His clinical subspecialty is consultation psychiatry with a research focus on cardiovascular medicine, stress physiology, ethnicity, and sleep. And he has authored or co-authored more than 500 publications. His honors and service have included being the past president of 3 major psychiatric research associations, the Academy for Behavioral Medicine Research, the American Psychosomatic System, and the Society for Behavioral Medicine. He has been editor-in-chief emeritus of Psychosomatic Medicine and a guest editor in Circulation, a major cardiovascular disease publication, and former editor-at-large of the Journal of Psychosomatic Research. He's been a consultant to the President's Commission on Mental Health and the Institute of Medicine, the National Academy of Sciences, the Department of Justice, NASA, and the NIH. I have known him most recently as an advisor to the UC Regents Health Sciences Committee, and served on that committee with him for several years. As a member of a task force that updated the diagnostic manual for psychiatry, called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, in this case, edition 5, he chaired a work group on somatic symptom disorders, and he is the winner of the aforementioned Dixon Award in 2019. Joel has recently written 2 nonfiction books for general readers. I enjoyed reading the first of these, Anatomy of Malice, The Enigma of Nazi War Criminals, published in 2016. I suspect that many of you have also read it or have at least heard Joel's riveting presentation on the subject. I'm relieved and delighted that his plane this morning from Texas arrived on time so that he could tell us about his latest book, Dark Persuasion, The History of Brainwashing from Pavlov to Social Media. Joel?
Thanks, Alan, and it's good to see everybody out there in Zoom land. I see you all on the crisp little postage stamp icons on my terminal, and I'm looking forward to opening up the campus when we will be together once more, other than on Zoom, or probably in addition to being on Zoom. I think what I'd like to do this afternoon is to talk about brainwashing in American culture and academia. And I'd like to address a number of questions. How did the term originate? How has our culture come to use and criticize the term? What has been our role in academia, and particularly University of California, in studying it? And then I'll turn to reviewing some of the high spots or low spots of the evolution of brainwashing in the 20th century. Please ask yourself, as I'm going through some of these vignettes, whether you think these are instances of brainwashing, and what makes you think perhaps yes or no. I'd like to share screen, so bear with me for a moment. Alan and all, can you see this?
Yes. Thank
Okay, okay. So as Alan mentioned, with Anatomy of Malice, I focused in that book on understanding how state leaders could orchestrate malice on a genocidal level. Subsequently, I started wondering how a population could be persuaded to pursue such a dark path. Were they inherently murderous, as some historians have suggested, or were they hoodwinked by propaganda? Or were they brainwashed? And what on earth did that term mean? Where did it come from? Even despite my intellectual interest in the topic, I would probably never have written this book if not for my neighbors who were members of the Heaven's Gate commune. A couple miles away from us, our neighbors had themselves castrated and then committed a mass suicide so they could teleport to the stars. It's one thing when there is a suicidal cult half a world away, but when it's in your own backyard, it demands study. And so I began my work on dark persuasion. When I tell people that I'm interested in brainwashing, the typical response is, Joel, brainwashing, isn't that musty, old, American Cold War, bad science, and morally challenged scientists? And I would have to say in response that it actually antedates the Cold War. Scientific brainwashing began at the turn of the 20th century, and it continues to evolve to this day. It is certainly not limited to the United States and has been carried out by some surprisingly diverse countries all across the world. Yes, there were plenty of bad scientists involved in this, but there were Nobel laureates as well. And finally, as you might expect, some of the scientists were morally challenged and some not. I think history takes place at that interesting intersection between the person and social forces in the environment. Well, where does this crazy term come from? And what does it mean? I think the first thing you have to understand and acknowledge is that the borders, the conceptual borders of brainwashing overlap with a lot of other things like indoctrination or persuasion, even conversion and education. All of these involve some aspects that are common territory. But when you really want to look at brainwashing, you're looking at phenomena that employ coercion, that is frequently surreptitiously applied. The victim is isolated. The intervention is harmful to the target. And all of this takes place in a context of extreme stress. Brainwashing appeared in 1950. It was introduced by a former OSS propaganda agent named Edward Hunter. And he based it loosely on a Chinese concept of Xinao, which has a very different connotation, more like a retreat to meditate and cleanse the heart. Hunter radically transformed this and basically said brainwashing is the terrifying new communist strategy to conquer the free world by destroying its mind. The threat of brainwashing was further magnified by the film Manchurian Candidate. As a result, we're struck with this term as a kind of a bogeyman versus the scientific alternate term of coercive persuasion. It's fashionable to criticize the term. People say it's foolish, it's like the Manchurian Candidate. Of course, it's an absurd idea. Other criticisms are that it blames the victim as weak and demeaning and disapproving of new things that you disagree with, akin to saying he's an idiot or she has been brainwashed. It has a tendency to be politicized as well. For many years, conservatives attacked liberals for some of their new ideas by saying they've been brainwashed. Today, liberals speak of Trump's followers as brainwashed. So I thought this evening it would be kind of interesting to look at a sociology of knowledge approach to examine how the word has been used and where. I used Google's Ngram analysis to examine word frequency in the entire English literature from books published from 1900 to 2000. As you can see, the term appears in 1950 and has never gone away. It continues to be used widely. Now, you might argue, well, just because a word is used widely doesn't mean you should take it seriously. Maybe it's like unicorns. For that reason, I consulted another database and I looked at PubMed to do an analysis of how the word was employed in biomedical literature. Again, the term is used widely. It's not going out of fashion at all. Finally, I looked at Google and I counted web pages, not manually, I assure you. And you can see that from our culture's point of view, brainwashing has 34 million web pages as compared to coercive persuasion of 48,000. So regrettably, we are stuck with this flamboyant term, and I'll continue using it as a shortcut, even though I'd like to suggest that the term coercive persuasion is a much more precise term. So just because you don't like the term brainwashing, does the phenomenon exist? So I thought I would pick out a few 20th century episodes to review. And many of these episodes describe how governments and academia worked jointly to study the area. The beginnings of coercive persuasion date back to the Russian Nobel winner Ivan Pavlov, who brought scientific methods to changing behavior. For decades, the West was preoccupied that Pavlov and the Soviets had made some kind of unholy alliance to change people's beliefs and actions. As the CIA put it, Soviet psychology is concerned with the concepts of Pavlov, the belief that men can deliberately be made to develop pre-designed types of thoughts and behaviors. Some of Pavlov's observations stemmed from this unusual situation portrayed here, the flooding of the Neva River. His labs were in that building in the basement. Dogs were all crated up for the evening. The staff had gone home. I'll read just a section from my book. The dogs were restless, penned in their cages in the basement of the Institute for Experimental Medicine. They were alone and weary from their daytime jobs in the professor's laboratory. But it wasn't the dark or the isolation or the fatigue that got to them. It was the incessant dripping and lapping of water on the floor of their kennel. Although it started out as a fairly typical overcast day, the rain increased until the Neva River flooded and it headed straight for the dogs. The water level in the kennel rose and the dogs started barking. At first, their paws sloshed around in the chilly water, but as the hours went by, the The water covered their bellies and shoulders until they were half floating in their cages, with their nostrils pressed anxiously against the wire mesh at the top of their cages. They howled in fear and desperately snuffled the air while they could get it. At the last minute, an animal handler rushed to the laboratory and rescued each dog, but to rescue the dog, he had to dump the dog under the crate, through the door of the crate, into the water, and he rescued them, but the dogs were never the same. The dispositions changed dramatically. The meek became aggressive, and the gregarious became shy. It was as if an entirely new being inhabited the dogs. This was bad enough, but the researchers were also struck by the fact that the dogs had forgotten all of the complex learning they had acquired in the laboratory. Their memories had been wiped clean. The staff talked about the dog's memory loss for weeks, and the scientists wrote their colleagues about the strange event. This might have been dismissed as a curiosity, except that it took place in the laboratory of Nobel laureate Ivan Pavlov. He built his career on meticulous observation and experimentation. For the rest of his life, he talked about the flood, and his comments about traumatic stress and memory reverberated widely, given his relationship with Russia's communist leaders. He was intrigued by the dog's behavior and started studying how behavior change could be brought about by stress. Ever the experimentalist, 2 months later, he re-exposed one of his dogs to a stream of water flowing into the dog's chamber. The dog froze and once again forgot all of his learned behavior. Pavlov theorized that trauma leads one to a breaking point, and that behavior can be changed profoundly by stress. This would all have led just to scientific papers, except for Lenin's interests. He visited Pavlov's laboratory, staying for 2 hours, asking Pavlov's help in molding the new Soviet man to build the new world of communism. Pavlov asked him, "Do you mean you would like to standardize the population of Russia, make them all behave the same way?" Lenin said, "Exactly, and you will help us." The Soviets handsomely supported Pavlov. Keep in mind that the early days of the Soviet Union were associated with famine and extreme poverty. Despite this, they gave Pavlov an institute and staffed it with 357 assistants, postdocs, animal handlers. 357 were to staff his Pavlovian Institute. Stalin also protected Pavlov. Even during the Great Terror, when Stalin attacked so many prominent party leaders, intellectuals, and military, Pavlov was safe. There's always been a suspicion that Pavlov influenced how prominent party officials were interrogated and induced to make unusual confessions during the show trials of the 1930s. After World War II, the Cold War started off with a resumption of show trials, this time involving Hungarian Cardinal József Mindszenty. This slide shows a before and after view of the cardinal. He was an ardent Hungarian nationalist who opposed any encroachment on the rights of the church. The communists imprisoned him, placed him in solitary, starved him so that he lost 50% of his weight, beat him, and drugged him. But what he writes later was that it was the monotony that got to him. Monotony shatters the nervous system and wears the soul thin. He eventually confessed to a series of unlikely deeds like trying to steal the Hungarian crown jewels. The West assumed that the confession was elicited through some special communist breakthrough in coercive persuasion. During World War II, Allies and Axis countries focused on drugs for interrogation, or as they called it, truth serum. Could a way be found to extract information from the enemy rapidly and reliably? Could one protect one's own agents or soldiers from disclosing secrets under truth serum? Truth serum has always captivated the popular imagination. In this cartoon, scientists learn that their truth serum works when a fisherman honestly describes how small the fish was that got away. The truth serums were drugs that were redeployed for new purposes. In obstetrics, various drugs were studied to help ease the pain of childbirth. They became popular after John Snow treated Queen Victoria. Initially, chloroform was used, but German doctors found that a combination of scopolamine and morphine was effective in eliciting what they called Dahmerschlaf, or twilight sleep. In 1916, obstetrician Robert House was performing a home delivery in a rural Texas farmhouse, and he used the German twilight sleep protocol. He observed a curious phenomenon. After delivering a baby, he looked around for a kitchen scale to weigh the baby and asked the husband had no idea. The wife, who was still sedated lying on the kitchen table after giving birth to the child, said groggily, "The scale is on a hook on the kitchen door behind a painting." House was intrigued. He became convinced that twilight sedation compelled the truth, that it was impossible to lie. Furthermore, he was convinced that the jails were full of people who were wrongly convicted. So sheriffs, prosecutors, and defense attorneys sought him out to interrogate prisoners to learn the truth. This technique assumed worldwide prominence. This is an engraving from a Spanish textbook of forensic psychiatry published about 100 years ago. Meanwhile, psychiatrists were experimenting with drugs to treat catatonia or fugue, dissociative memory loss, and battle fatigue. Various barbiturate compounds could get patients talking and remembering. My old professor Lindemann noted after administering the drug, there was a feeling of well-being and serenity, a desire to communicate, a willingness to speak about very personal problems, usually not spoken of to strangers. These observations on drugs and truth-telling were of great importance to the military in World War II. The Nazis experimented with Dachau concentration camp inmates, spiking their coffee with mescaline to see if people would confide their secrets. They noted that the prisoners became more talkative, but were unconvinced about the drug's utility for military purposes. Meanwhile, the United States set up a secret commission to study if truth drugs could be designed to speed interrogation of prisoners of war. Curiously, we focused a great deal on marijuana. The OSS worked with leading academics to study how useful such drugs were and to investigate if people could really be compelled to tell the truth. They tested if people could use cover stories to avoid talking about secrets while under the drugs. And here they relied on academics for experimental design. One of the principal academics who studied truth drugs and interrogation was Louis Gottschalk, who became the founding chairman of psychiatry at UC Irvine. Indeed, one of the major clinic buildings on campus is named for him. He would be just one of many UC faculty involved in the study of coercive persuasion. The drugs were hardly infallible. Furthermore, Justice Potter Stewart ruled that a confession induced by the administration of drugs is constitutionally inadmissible in a criminal trial. That doesn't stop frustrated courts from occasionally considering their use, even recently in the case of the accused Colorado mass shooter, James Holmes. Meanwhile, half a world away, the biggest flashpoint of the Cold War took place in Korea. It was a vicious conflict fought in extreme conditions. The United States was unprepared for the war, sent troops to Korea in the dead of winter, dressed in summer tropical weight uniforms, and the front lurched widely north and south, like a football game with a poor defense. In the first year of the war, many American troops were captured. There were high death rates amongst the POWs, and many collaborated with the enemy, broadcasting anti-war messages. When the armistice was finalized, all prisoners were given a choice of where they wanted to be relocated. We crowed when many of the POWs from China and North Korea preferred to settle in Taiwan and Japan and the West. We were absolutely flummoxed when 21 American POWs refused to come home, preferred instead to settle in China or Russia. How had this happened? What happened to them in the prison camps? The Chinese treated prisoners with a mixture of brutality and kindness. There was an unusual methodical quality. They subjected them to ceaseless propaganda, forced them to write long confessions, placed them in groups where they denounced each other. Jolly West, who would go on to become the chair of psychiatry at UCLA, studied the phenomenon intensively. Not only did the Chinese get American POWs to confess to war crimes and make anti-war propaganda broadcasts, but the Chinese seemed to get better results over time. In the course of a year and a half, the percent of prisoners caving into pressure and making confessions and propaganda broadcasts increased from 25% to 75%. America viewed this with consternation. On the one hand, there was fear that the Chinese had invented some horrible secret weapon designed by Pavlov originally. On the other hand, our troops were viewed as cowards for caving in. There was no understanding what they had been through. This Herblock cartoon captures the mood at home. Two executives sitting at their private club in stuffed leather chairs, smoking cigars and drinking scotch, are talking about world events. One says to the other smugly that he would never have caved in. Instead, he would have said to the Reds, "Now see here." People lost sight of the fact that the prisoners were treated with extraordinary brutality. Indeed, the death rate in Korea exceeded that found in Japan or Vietnam. It's been the highest death rate ever encountered in American POWs. Two critics of the Korean War were particularly harsh in their judgment of our soldiers. To their mind, the GIs had no gumption. They were victims of momism. The fault was that liberals had sapped our strength so much that there was no discipline, so that 38% of the prisoners allowed themselves to die. Other voices were not so sure about that judgment. They pointed to the prisoners' debility due to starvation and exposure to severe cold, their total dependency on their captors, and the constant dread of being forced to witness executions or being subjected to mock executions. In light of the Korean experience, President Eisenhower was advised to start a Brainwar Offensive that would bring together the CIA and academic researchers. Allen Dulles, head of the CIA, felt that there was a contest with Russia to develop new techniques of brainwashing. The Russians take selected human beings whom they wish to destroy and turn them into humble confessors of crimes they never committed. New techniques wash the brain clean of the thoughts. Indirect CIA funding flowed to university researchers through foundations and research institutes. Harold Wolff and Larry Hinkle at Cornell received funds and channeled money through the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. This MK-Ultra funding supported scores of university laboratories across the country. Wolff at that time was America's leading neurologist, and Hinkle was a brilliant internist who studied stress and heart disease. Wolff worked closely with the CIA on various mission-driven projects that raised profound ethical considerations. Here we see how Wolff answered a delicate question posed by a CIA agent working with MK-Ultra. What is the possibility of working out a graph indicating the state of panic of the enemy based upon the varying degree of pressure used? To which Wolff replied smoothly, "Yours is a very provocative notion, and I'm sure it could be documented. Warm regards." A shocking response from the tacit head of American neurology at the time, but it gets worse. Wolff's proposal to the CIA started off pretty ominously. Potentially useful secret drugs and brain-damaging procedures will be tested in order to ascertain their fundamental effect upon brain function. As these drugs are investigated, a concurrent search for antidotes or countermeasures will be conducted. Then the protocol veered into an even more shocking direction. Where any of these studies involve harm to the subject, we expect the agency to make available suitable subjects a proper place for the performance of the necessary experiments. In other words, he wanted the agency to furnish the subjects and then dispose of them. MK-Ultra devoted enormous resources on studying LSD, determining its dose, if there was habituation with continued use, if there was an antidote, could it be used to immobilize an enemy? The studies frequently involved unwitting individuals surreptitiously dosed, and there were casualties. My old colleague Chet Pierce on the left and Jolly West in the middle infamously dosed an elephant Tusco at the Oklahoma City Zoo in an effort to understand how LSD influenced aggressive behavior. The elephant died. Perhaps the most notorious experiment involved Frank Olson, a government scientist who was surreptitiously dosed with LSD dropped into his Cointreau at an agency country retreat. And he became severely depressed and agitated. This family photo shows him as a father in happier times. The CIA took him to see Dr. Abramson, an LSD expert who had ties with the CIA. Rather than immediately hospitalize this VIP patient, Abramson sent him back to the Statler Hotel with 2 CIA minders. Olson died that night after falling out of his hotel window. It's not clear if it was an accident, if he jumped, or if he was pushed. The family was never told about the secret LSD dosing, and the CIA covered this up for decades until the story blew up. Perhaps some of you are familiar with the Jason Bourne books and movies. I adore them and find them refreshing distractions. Recall the plot. Jason Bourne is a somewhat disconsolate young soldier played by Matt Damon. He goes to see an avuncular psychiatrist who agrees to radically restructure the young man's life. The doctor destroys the man's memories and trains him to become Jason Bourne, the consummate assassin. It's a compelling story and one that is actually true, except for the bit about the assassin training. It describes one of the most notorious CIA-sponsored brainwashing studies. The work was done in Montreal. The CIA had supported the eminent psychologist Donald Hebb on his studies of the effects of sensory isolation. Hebb observed that when people were isolated from their environment, they became highly suggestible. Meanwhile, across town, psychiatrist Ewan Cameron headed up the Allen Institute of Psychiatry. Dr. Cameron believed that psychotherapy could be speeded up if you simply obliterated old memories with massive doses of ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, as well as cocktails of drugs. After weeks of this, he played tape loops up to 250,000 times while his patients slept to teach them how they should think and feel. He succeeded in destroying memories, but could not show that his patients learned from the tape repetitions. The lawsuits are still being adjudicated. From roughly 1915 to 1965, governments and universities tried to develop tools for brainwashing. They weren't exactly successful. Torture didn't persuade people to adopt different political beliefs, nor did it elicit information reliably. Any number of drugs could sedate, stimulate, or confuse people, but they were not effective in interrogations or persuasion. Group pressure, sensory isolation, sleep deprivation were very promising tools for persuasion, but these required time and finesse. In the 1970s and 1980s, 2 unlikely players emerged, demonstrating new techniques in dark persuasion. These were kidnappers and clerics. On August 23rd, 1973, Jan Erik Olson entered the Kreditbanken Bank in Stockholm. His goal was to rob the bank and get the police to release his friend from jail. He took the bank staff hostage and held them in the vault while negotiating with the police. Over the ensuing days, the hostages started collaborating with their captor, developed fondness for him, and began to distrust the police. He didn't torture, shoot, or rape the hostages. He was solicitous of them and caressed them. As one hostage put it, when he treated us well, we could think of him as God. When the police eventually liberated the hostages, they hugged the bank robber and shook hands in farewell, calling out, "We'll see you again." This wasn't just some one-off Scandinavian liberal aberration. Similar events have been seen all over the world, sometimes involving terrorists, sometimes kidnappings for money or sexual exploitation. The term of art that law enforcement uses is Hobbus, or hostage and barricade situation. We have a dishearteningly large number of Hobbus situations to study. To a certain extent, the hostage is correct to distrust the police. In a kidnapping rescue situation, he or she is much more likely to be shot by the police than the rescuer. Indeed, 50% of hostages form some kind of positive bond with their captor. The extent of the full-blown Stockholm syndrome is unclear. Considerable work from all over the world has attempted to define what kind of hostage situation or what kind of hostage or person is more likely to be associated with this paradoxical fondness for the hostage taker. Stockholm-like phenomena appear more likely during longer captivity, and children in particular appear to be particularly vulnerable. The Patricia Hearst kidnapping could be considered a variant of Stockholm, another bank robbery half a world away and half a year later after Stockholm. I've touched on how coercive persuasion evolved in the hands of government agencies, academia, and criminals. I'd like to finish by discussing how cults have used coercive persuasion. There have been many, many small groups, frequently with religious, spiritual, or personal growth agendas. Many of these have veered off into violence and coercive persuasion. I have time only to discuss our homegrown cult of Heaven's Gate. Heaven's Gate began in Houston and was led by Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, who renamed themselves Bo or Do and T or D. They were convinced that they literally belonged with the stars and that they were trapped on Earth in bodies that were actually archaic vehicles from space. They started wandering about and proselytizing about UFOs and redemption. They formed a small group called Heaven's Gate and preached a life of asceticism. Get your vehicle under control was their motto. They preached eating pure food and avoiding sexuality, which they felt corroded their vessels. Some even had themselves castrated to stop sexual temptation. They emphasized conformity and renamed themselves with peculiar names. They discouraged contact with family and old friends. Instead, they meditated and listened to lectures. They had a very precise set of rules to help them find their way in the world. Major offenses were deceit or sensuality. Lesser offenses included having private thoughts or being curious. Over the years, the membership dwindled and the feel of the group darkened. When T died of cancer, Bo started wondering whether suicide would be advisable. By that point, they were living in a mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, where incidentally they were webmasters, and their last commission was for the Fairbanks Ranch Polo Group. We might never have heard of them, and they might never have killed themselves, except for the bad luck of the Hale-Bop Comet. In 1996 and 1997, this was the brightest and longest lasting comet in known history. It came upon us as a surprise, and I'm sure we all remember it. Bo was convinced that trailing the comet was a spaceship coming to take them home to the stars. In addition, he persuaded the group that if they killed themselves during the comet's closest pass to Earth, they would teleport finally to stars and immortality. The group vowed to kill themselves, but videotaped farewells in advance. Sitting tranquilly in the grounds of their mansion, they talked about their joy in anticipating the next step. Some tried to head off criticism, anticipating that the press would paint them as disturbed. In their words, "This is my family. Laying down this vehicle is going to be great. I'm shedding it like a husk. I'm tired of this world. This is going to be great." Over the course of one day, they killed themselves in 3 waves. All dressed the same, they ingested vodka, barbiturates mixed with pudding, put plastic bags over their heads, and then they were gone. When the bodies were discovered and autopsied, the pathologists were astonished to find that many of the men had been castrated. I focused on brainwashing in the 20th century. While it was tempting to talk about current trends and controversies, I think we need more distance and time to have a dispassionate perspective. I do have some thoughts on things that might develop in the future. The first challenge will be neuroscience. We were able to do some surprising things in the 1960s. James Olds stimulated pleasure and pain circuits and was able to shape rodent behavior accordingly. Robert Heath pioneered in deep brain stimulation, studying how implanted electrodes could modify complex behavior in people. The CIA famously approached Heath and asked that he work with them on studying pleasure and pain circuits, but he spurned their invitation, saying, "I'm a doctor, not a spy." We can do much more than Heath did today with safer and more precise surgery. We are restrained by a sense of professional ethics by focusing on clinical conditions. Would that restraint always prevail? I think the bigger challenge will clearly come from social media. I think we all remember the thrill of computers and email, computerized literature searches and personal computers that appeared in the mid-70s, and the appearance of web-based search engines in the mid-1990s. I think the biggest challenge for coercive persuasion will come from social media. It offers so much promise, but there is a dark side. And we need to ask ourselves if social media can be weaponized as a tool for coercive persuasion. When COVID vaccinations were developed so rapidly, we rejoiced and thought that our colleagues in pharmaceutical research had saved the day. You saw how that played out. We ignored the need for meticulous communication research and were ambushed by social media. If social media is associated with bullying, coercion, surreptitious monitoring, and restricted information, one has to wonder if it can be a tool for coercive persuasion. Recall that brainwashing is facilitated by limited interactions with outsiders and when people are subjected to stress. How well does that describe the capabilities of social media when it's deployed for disinformation, fake news, and stoking extremism? Some have wondered if social media is addictive. Others have observed that heavy social media users are sleep restricted and thereby even more suggestible. Thus, the case is stronger for worrying about social media and coercive persuasion. In one sense, social media is just another new social intoxicant. And we know from the example of drinking and driving, it takes many decades for cultures to develop expectations, norms, and regulations for how one interacts with new social intoxicants. In Shakespeare's Henry IV, he called rumor stuffing the ears of men with false reports. With the internet, we can now stuff the ears much faster. A Rand Corporation report warned that on social media, a fire hose of falsehoods can drown out competing information. The report concluded pessimistically, don't expect to counter the fire hose of falsehood with the squirt gun of truth. Social media can be so compelling that it verges on being coercive. With its hidden algorithms and incentives aligned with clickbait, it is subliminally persuasive in ways that can be profoundly destructive to the user. Tomorrow's brainwashers couldn't help exploring the possibilities of social media. Plato cautioned that storytellers rule the world. Tomorrow's citizens will have to evaluate the storyteller's tales on social media with great care. So I'd be delighted if anybody has questions, comments, whatever.